Welcome to the territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and the shared territory of Vancouver. We have 4 areas in Vancouver that we share. And also welcome to this very interesting evening. It's been a very interesting day for me today. I started at 7 this morning, and I don't even know what time it is now. But I've got to go home to a little princess who just celebrated her 8th birthday today. The second youngest great-granddaughter of mine who claims that I'm the best nanny she has. And she's not sure if I'm a paid nanny or a nanny. But I've looked after her for a number of years, making sure she got to kindergarten and grade 1, and she's in grade 2 now. I'm very upset with the school system. They're not teaching her what she wants to learn. And she's decided Nanny needs to go to university. Nanny needs to learn how to count. And believe it or not, Nanny also needs to learn how to do ballet. Can you imagine me doing ballet? Yep. Yes. Can you honestly do it? Think I could do? Yes. I couldn't tippy-toe, that's why she's sending me to ballet school. So just a little history of my day-to-day life. And I've been with SFU now for 19 years, and I've been working with the president going on almost 10 years now. And looking forward to retiring and finishing all my arts and crafts. I got stacked in the corner of my living room. So just a quick prayer to get this evening going. You may remain seated. Great Spirit, thank you for bringing us together this evening. Just guide each and every one of us in the path that we are walking, and thanking our communities from where we come from and our families for allowing us to do the work that we do. And just a very special blessing on each and every one of you from where you come from in your family. And a very special blessing on this evening as you are guided in the next pathway on my relations.
Good evening. I'm Julie Concan-King, the Associate Director of Programs at Equitas, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening to this space generously donated by SFU. I want to thank you, Elder Margaret, for reminding us that it's an honor to be here this evening and to be able to host such a dialogue in this space. Also, that it's an honor to be here on unceded Coast Salish territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. This event wouldn't be possible without our committed partners from SFU, Andrew Hall and the team at the Van City Office for Community Engagement, Brenda Morrison from the SFU Centre for Restorative Justice, Jennifer Reddy and Shanti Besso from SFU Lifelong Learning, as well as the ongoing financial support of TD Bank and the Reddy Commitment. I'll also take a moment to thank you for coming this evening with your open minds, with your ideas, and your commitment to learning about how we can be building more inclusive, resilient, connected communities. I see some familiar faces in the room, but for those of you who are new to Equitas, I can assure you that this is at the center of what Equitas does. Whether that's here in our office in BC, where we've been since 2009, whether that's in the more than 50 communities we work in across Canada, whether that's internationally, we are thinking about how to make our communities more connected and resilient places. We are working with our partners in the community, the public, and the private sector, and we are using human rights education to create opportunities for groups who face exclusion to take up space, to find their voice, to take on leadership roles, to build movements, and to claim their rights and help shape positive social change. I've had the absolute privilege of traveling with Rita the last week, and I know you will have a great pleasure hearing from her. from her today. Rita carries with her her own story. Additionally, she carries the stories of diverse people from around the world, where individuals and groups are courageously working to make sure ideas of inclusion, equity, and resilience are lived in the everyday. Today, in a time when we are filled with so many negative messages of division and opposition, I want to thank you for taking the time this evening to hear these messages, these stories, and to take your own actions to support the building of inclusive, respectful communities, so everyone in our country has an equal opportunity to be part of the conversation and fully participate. And now, it's my honor to give the floor to Rita.
Does it work? It's really a pleasure to be here, and not really a pleasure, but a very humbling experience, because I understand that you came out to spend your Tuesday afternoon with our amazing panelists, but I don't know why you came to see me. And I'm really humbled that you actually decided to come and spend these 2 hours with me and with us and with Equitas. And I'm saying this because, as you heard, as a former UN Special Rapporteur on minority issues, I had the privilege to travel across the world. I visited dozens of countries. I've never counted it. It should be 40, 50. And in every country I went, I actually organized meetings with women only and minority women meetings, so they can have a safe space of dialogue where they can talk about their own journey. And I encountered so many strong women who came from much more difficult situations and life circumstances than I came. And so I'm really humbled to be here in front of you and talk about, because I wish I could share their stories. The stories of those minority women who have been abducted or raped by terrorist organizations, those who ended up as being refugees in a country but now leading voices in politics. And there are really amazing women, and I wish that they could all be here and talk to you as well. But I was encouraged to say a few words about where I come from and who I am, because the title is A Woman's Journey. So I'm trying to share my journey with you. And as you heard, I am from Hungary, and I was born into a mixed family, as we would say, because my mother comes from a Roma or Gypsy background, and my father came from a kind of a well-off Hungarian ethnic background, and they were one of the first couples in Hungary who had these inter-ethnic marriages. And on the top of that, my mom was institutionalized. She was abandoned by her parents, and she was brought up not in a foster care, because that time Hungary didn't have real foster homes, but she would be put together with all kinds of people who needed a home, like criminals, prostitutes, and others. So she was not really in a very loving and caring environment, and she has never been taken by foster parents. So she really grew up in state institutions, and in fact, she had to travel from one town to another. So she wasn't even stable because she spent her time in different cities and villages. So when they decided to get married, now you have this gypsy girl coming from an orphanage, and then you have this Hungarian man coming from an agricultural family. The national radio traveled to their home, to the home of my father's parents, and they asked the parents of my father about what they think about this possible marriage. And apparently my grandfather was hitting the table and said that this is unacceptable, and the family will not allow my father to marry my mother, because they will have no friends, nobody will sit next to them, and they will be isolated for a lifetime, and they don't want this to happen to their son. But I'm so proud of my father, who went still against the odds and against the flood, and he still decided to marry my mother. And so this is how I was born. 4 years later, my father really had to fight his way through the family to get my mom accepted. And whether it's a finished story, I think that we could talk about it later, but that kind of racism has really been embedded in Hungary, and the stigmatization against Gypsy and Roma people. And so when I grew up, I came from this modest family. My father actually is a TV mechanic. And so when I was 14 years old and about to choose a career, my mother went to the school and asked the headmaster, the head of my class, about what she recommends me for my future as a profession. And my mother was advised that I should I should go for a vocational school, maybe to be a tailor or a cook, but I should not be aspiring for like something higher because I don't really have the skills to go for a stronger school. And my mom tells me the story that apparently she came home, she told me this, and I was so angry that I opened the newspapers, because then the listing just came out of the schools, and apparently I chose the hardest school in the neighborhood, not even the town, but I actually traveled 60 kilometers away to a boarding school, because that was the hardest that time. And so when I got accepted to this school, my mom was confronted about, like, how did you put your child inside? What did you do? Who did you bribe? And then she said, well, she just passed the test. But people still didn't believe it. It was so strange for them that me coming from this background could actually get into a Catholic, very strong and high school with a good reputation. And so what happened is that, again, when I had to choose a university, people told me, like, well, maybe you shouldn't go to a university. High school is good enough for you. And so I decided to go for the law school, because I'm like, you know, I just have to prove them wrong. And to be honest, I had no desire to study law. I never liked lawyers. I never felt like I can be part of that community. I saw them as, like, you know, like a level of society which is so elite, and I don't have a place among them. But because they told me I can't do it, I wanted to prove I can do it. So I got accepted to the law school. I was completely lost, as I thought I would be. I never found my place among the others. But anyway, I tried to work hard to get through from one year to another. And what happened then is I took up students' jobs because I was not really in a good financial position. So I was waitressing during the nights, as like most students do. But I also worked for a company which actually assisted in national holidays to organize different programs for delegations and for the NATO members that time. And so I remember I used to work for this company. I was at the third year of the law school. I was happy. It was like decent money. I got to meet interesting people at interesting places. And then they would just stop calling me at one point. And then, you know, at the beginning, you know, you think like, okay, maybe there are like prettier girls, or, you know, like they choose somebody maybe who speaks better English or better German, because I spoke 2 languages then. But it was repeatedly, like I was just not included, I was not invited, I didn't get a job and assignment again. And so when I confronted the company, the secretary of the company told me, like, oh, Rita, I don't want to tell you the reason. I'm like, there's a reason? Like, there's a concrete reason? I said, you have to tell me, because I want to learn from it, and maybe I can improve myself. And then she said, you know, the company's owner just found out that your mother is Gypsy, because my mom's name is a really traditional Roma name. And so he said that he just found it out, and he thought that this is too shameful for a company to be represented by a Roma girl, so we have to let you go. And it's interesting how that was shocking then, but it became a blessing later. Because is there are there lawyers in the room among yourselves? A few, yeah? Okay. I mean, I don't know how you felt, but I had no clue what I would do when I finished university. I didn't know whether I want to do civil law, economic law, business law, criminal law, where I'm going to with this diploma. But when this happened, I knew that my mission is to work on protecting the rights of the minorities and to step up my game and fight against discrimination and racism. So actually that really was a real push, and that put me on a right track. So I worked for an organization right away, which defended the rights of the Roma. And that was my first career, and I did it for 4 years. We were doing strategic litigation. I would take cases to local courts, but we also took cases to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. And I would do research, I would do advocacy, and write reports to the UN. And so it's very interesting that a few years later I ended up being one of those committee members who receives now those reports from the NGOs that I have been writing one day. So my journey has been, I think, about anger and about proving people wrong, and about trying to fight my way out of the box that I was supposed to be, like, was supposed to stay in. Because when you come from a minority group, people easily think that your skills are limited and your life chances are limited. And it's so easy to believe it. And it's so dangerous to believe it. And I find myself very lucky that I had a mom who was a fighter. My mother fought through her entire life. And so she was my role model. And that's why I'm saying, like, I don't think my story is, I mean, really a story of a real fighter, because it's the story of my mother. I think she's the real fighter, and she just paved the way, and I just followed her footsteps. But I think she's the real hero, and it's a pity she can't be here. She's fine, she's still a hero, and she's still a fighter. She's back in Hungary, and I miss her because I live in Senegal, in Dakar at the moment. And so what people ask me often is, like, if I travel to so many countries as a minority myself, what did I experience? What did I learn from these travels? And many things I learned, professionally, personally. I went through a lot of emotional ups and downs. It's really hard to listen to horror stories that people go through, to see their pictures or even see their own injuries that they have because of violence. And when they look at you and they ask you to change their lives, to put electricity to their villages, to make sure that they have a tarmac road, and you're just a UN expert, and all I can do is to get their stories and put it in a report. And I understand that when I visited Yazidi and Christian women in IDP camps in Iraq, you know, what they needed is not what I could give them. And it's heartbreaking to listen to them, to hold their hands and tell them, I can't help you with that. And so I always felt like maybe I am considered to be a successful person, but sometimes I really question my own successes, because I felt like there's so much more that I should have been able to do, but I was limited to do. So in these situations, what I was telling these women, and usually these minorities, that what I can do is to be your loudspeaker. I can echo your stories. And so it doesn't only become a story that is hidden in this village, but it will be in a United Nations report and brought to New York. So all those ambassadors have to know your story. So I really thought of myself as a storyteller as well, to gather all the stories of people who were unheard. And they were unheard because people didn't want to listen to them. It's not because they didn't have a voice. It's because they were deliberately silenced, or preferably unheard, as Arundhati Roy says, a very famous Indian writer. And so I saw myself as really just an amplifier of the voices of these communities. And what I saw about conflicts and tensions in societies, I think my main lesson is that just people don't wake up one day and start hating each other. We have to reject those simplified narratives of the world. It's not like there is a Christian community and a Muslim community, and then they live together for centuries well, and then one day they wake up and, oh, you pray differently? Oh, you say Allah and not God? I hate you. It doesn't work like this. What is the problem when there is a deficit in governance, good governance, in the rule of law, or in democracy? And then it gets exacerbated by unequal access to resources, to power, to territory. People are forced to compete, but that competition is not balanced and not equal and not just. This is when we have a problem. And when minority rights get violated or neglected, when those voices are not being taken into consideration, this is when we can see tensions. So we should never believe these narratives about people just hating each other for no reason. It's the governments, it's the power people who put us, and sometimes religious leaders, who put us in those situations. So we have to be very alert and not fall for those stories. And so what is the guarantee for resilient societies to be together? If you look at minority rights, what actually the Declaration on Minorities says is that states have a responsibility to have legal, administrative, or territorial arrangements to allow groups to protect and promote their identity. So the question is whether there are different mechanisms and laws in place to cater to people's needs, but at the same time to let them freely enjoy their identity and live with their identity. So the question is about shared societies. The question is about shared realities. And I can tell you during this past, well, now it's like 10 days of touring around Canada and having different roundtable discussions with amazing people coming from the corporate world, from governments, from NGOs and from communities. One issue I think is in front of us is you have a shared city, you have a shared province, you have a shared country, but do you have shared realities? Do you have the same understanding of what people go through? Or do the different communities coming from different backgrounds have different understanding of what is going on? And so if you do have a different understanding, if an indigenous person experiences an everyday life differently from a black person, and that person experiences it differently from a Russian person or from a Chinese person, how do we make sure that we understand each other? How do we make sure that my story does not become the only story? How do I understand that my life in this city can be so different from the lives of the others just because I look different? And this can be positive or negative. It can be a privilege that you are granted to because of the way you look like, but it can be a stigma and a discrimination that is granted to you. And I just give you one maybe small example of those different realities. When I grew up and I was in a small town, people told me that in the capital of Hungary, in Budapest, Roma people are sometimes denied access to public places. But I heard the same about like black people, that Africans cannot go to certain places. I genuinely believe that this is fake. It's fake news. I was like, there must be something wrong with these people. Maybe they don't behave well, maybe they are drunk, maybe their dresses are not appropriate, because it never happened to me, right? So even if it happened to other Roma people, I didn't believe the story until I moved to the capital. And one day we had a Roma training, and it was a big group of Roma girls and boys, but intellectuals. We were all medical and university like law students. And I wanted to go to a nightclub. I mean, this was like a live music concert. And they said, full, no entry. I was like, really? So we stepped aside, and we saw some white Hungarians just easily going down. And so it happened twice again to me, but the next 2 times I was with my African friends. And that was such an eye-opening experience, because I understand that just because it has not happened to me before, it doesn't mean it doesn't happen to others. And this is why we need this kind of dialogues and continued systematic dialogues in our societies to understand what people go through. So we don't just understand the world through our own eyes, but also through the eyes of the others. And so what we need, I think, and this is what I heard even today during the roundtable discussion, is this open and safe and comfortable spaces for uncomfortable discussions. People want to talk about racism. People want to talk about the difficulties they encounter, but they want to have meaningful, genuine, and deep discussions. And so I'm really grateful for Equitas for actually creating this space here today. And I understand that this is one of the first occasions that Equitas is doing it. And I hope that today's event will lead us to a series of similar events, and that you and also me in my own capacities will be able to create those spaces so we can continue the dialogue and we can really help each other see the world through the lenses of the other people, so that the other and the us, it becomes us. And we will all be able to understand each other and have that solidarity that we all need to go forward and have a peaceful and friendly and inclusive society. Thank you.
All the different heights here. Thank you so much, Rita, for setting the foundation and really starting us off on a spirit of inspiration and motivation as we continue this conversation. My name is Angie Osachoff, and I'm the Regional Program Manager for Equitas in our BC office, and I'm thrilled to welcome all of you here today. To go over the format for the next hour or so, we're going to invite some esteemed panelists to join us in the conversation. I'm going to moderate a dialogue where they'll have the opportunity to share their reflections on what Rita said and to talk about their experiences, their knowledge, and their understanding of what it takes to build connected, resilient communities, and to connect it to human rights as well. After that, we're going to open up the floor to a question and answer, where we would like to invite all of you to participate, ask all the questions. Between all of them, we have a wealth of knowledge and experience. And after that, if there's time left, you're welcome to stay, mingle, and gather some information. So as I call our panelists up, I'd like to invite them to have a seat. As soon as all of them are sitting with us, they're all going to introduce themselves and give you a quick opening statement and reflection about their work and their reflections on what Rita has had to say. So first, I'd like to introduce Robert Dom. He's a fellow and senior consultant at SFU Morris J. Wask Centre for Dialogue, a member of the Board of Directors of Reconciliation Canada, and a chair of the Laurier Institution. Thank you, Robert. Next, I'd like to introduce Brenda Morrison. Brenda is the Director for the Centre of Restorative Justice at SFU and an Associate Professor in SFU School of Criminology and a member of the Child Rights Academic Network. Thank you, Brenda. I just realized I'm not going in that order. I apologize. I'm going in the order I wrote down. And last but not least, Hannah Woldzai, who is a community leader and an activist who we're thrilled to have join us as she shapes a future for young people in our country. And so finally, unfortunately, Mr. Albuquerque is not able to join us tonight due to a family emergency, and we're sad he's not here, but we're hoping we'll be able to engage him in future dialogues in Vancouver, as this is his home city. So I'm going to make my way over quietly and probably not discreetly to that chair, but while I do, I would like to invite all of the panelists to start with the introduction of themselves and to provide reflections on what Rita shared in her presentation from their areas of work, knowledge, activism, and expertise.
Hi, good evening, everyone. It's great to be here among all of you. My name is Hannah Woldes. I am a second-year political science student, and I am involved in different community organizations in the Lower Mainland. So I am part of and the co-founder of ADMICO, which is youth-focused advisory mentorship program that work with young adult immigrant and refugee youth. So we mostly focused on youth that grow out of high school who come to Canada in their late teens and are not able to complete their credits in high school, and we work towards making their lives a little bit easier, because it's not easy mostly coming here when you're over 15 and have to go to high school and not finish your credit and have to choose between basic education and living, so which is working or education. I'm also involved with Fresh Voices, which is a group of young immigrant and refugee youth with the support of adults that advocates for the rights of immigrant and refugee youth. We work with decision makers and stakeholders to make decisions that include young people. I also sit on the Provincial Multiculturalism Council, which advised the minister that is responsible for multiculturalism. And Equal Voice, last but not least, Equal Voices, which is a bilingual, multi-partisan that works towards engaging young women in politics. So it opens up a platform that allows more women to get into all levels of politics.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Brenda Morrison, and I'm grateful to see each and every one of you. I'm also grateful that I was born, and I'm privileged to say that I was born on the unceded territory of the Squamish Nation. And so I always had an adventurous spirit. You found me in the mountains a lot as growing up. And that adventurous spirit took me down around the world and down to Australia. A number of years later, I came back with a husband, a PhD, and 2 children. So it was a great holiday. You should try sometime. And so I came back to work with the Centre for Restorative Justice. And one of the other things that I did down in Australia was, I think, and it was a real game changer with me. I used to be an Outward Bound instructor. And I used to work on the land, and I deepened my understanding of myself and my relationships with groups and my fellow travelers. We always thought of Outward Bound as an adventure, a journey. And so my work with the Center for Restorative Justice has just deepened that journey. So, it develops the relational ecology. The practice of restorative justice deepens the relational ecology of ourselves with our land, with our culture, with our people. And so I'm just grateful to be here continuing this work. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really grateful to be here too. I don't know if it's because I'm a middle child or if it's just the existential situation with which that I've been living, or with which I've been struggling for many years, and it's become particularly vivid and top of mind for me as I think back on the last 7 months of work that I had the opportunity and the privilege to do with the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. I'm not going to talk about that particular work because it's not my place. I just want to say that the amazing women who've been leading this process are going to speak to Canada and to the world with a voice that is, I hope, going to carry sufficient weight to move any unmoved hearts on this issue. When I said I'm sort of caught in a way, I'm caught because I can't talk about that, and I also am not trying to virtue signal, which is, I think, an appropriate thing for us to keep in mind. And cultural humility is important, but not so much that, you know, we're kind of making a big show of how humble we are. And at the same time, it's easy to remove oneself from a situation because one feels one doesn't have a role. I can be outraged by the treatment of people who are not allowed into spaces that I might be able to pass into. As a man who's married to a man, there are places that I can pass into without being stopped, and there are other places where if I'm holding his hand, I can't enter. I enjoy many privileges from being here in this land. I was just chatting briefly with, I think it was with Hannah maybe, about the fact that I think somebody, I guess Brenda was talking about how she went away for a number of years and then she came home. And we were talking about who came from somewhere else. And it really struck me that I feel at home here in a way that I didn't growing up in the US, because my great-grandparents were allowed to enter this country as refugees from World War I with my grandmother and all but 3 of her older sisters. And I've come back. I'm the only one from the family who came back because they left for New York a few years later. I can't imagine what it's like to be a person with dark skin walking around in racist white communities. But I had my mother's first cousin was a slave laborer at Auschwitz, and I've learned as much as one can who doesn't live that experience to be alert to the fact that all around us are people walking around with very complicated stories, very complicated pasts, and there are a lot of people in a lot of rooms who are potential collaborators and partners in doing the extremely complex and daunting work that is ahead of us. I was reading recently a piece by Amy Gallo about dealing with conflict in work situations, and I don't remember if it was her words or if someone she quoted, but she said, if you find yourself in a situation where you're confronting a racist statement or a misogynist statement, or ask yourself before you respond whether you want to make a statement or you want to make a difference. There are times when you have to make a statement. But if you want to make a difference, you have to do the kind of work that, that Rita's been talking about, the kind of work that Hannah's doing and that many people in this room are doing. It's relationship-based. It takes time. It's collaborative. It requires cultural humility. It requires listening, doing a lot of listening and a lot of learning. And I truly believe that profound change is possible. But we can't take shortcuts. It can't be transactional. It can't be short term. We have to focus on process and on goals. And we need to find the people with whom we can work and from whom we need to learn.
Rita, I know you've already introduced yourself and shared, but is there anything you'd like to add before the next question?
Well, I think Robert took us down in the depth of this whole discussion and where we should go. And I really appreciate your comments, because I think you started with a very important notion about how we step up for each other, and do I have the right to step up, or do I leave the communities to step up, and what's my role if I don't belong to the same community. And I do have a vision on that. And my vision is that, coming from a minority community, I really believe in the importance of building that solidarity beyond your community. And what I mean is that, as you probably know, according to the critical race theory, if there is a group in a society which is considered inferior, the voices coming from that group will be also considered inferior. So these people will need somebody from the outside who can amplify their voices. And it's not because they can't speak up for themselves. It's not because they are not educated or eloquent or sophisticated. It's just because the power imbalances in a society could be such that their voice would be rendered less important. And so my work, as when I go to missions, and especially when I talk to young people who are active on social media, my message is always, as you said, that you have to make a statement, but in my mind, you have to make a statement with knowing the long-term impacts of that statement. And what I mean is that we had this discussion during the past days about whether it makes any sense to engage into discussions with the xenophobic, racist, populist, neo-Nazi, right-wing people. And so people think that it's a waste of time because you won't convince them otherwise. And it might be very true. But what I ask people to consider is that how your message resonates with those who agree with you. Because when we go to social media and we fight hate messages, you are not putting your rejection because you want to convince the others that they are wrong, because you maybe never convince them, but you leave your message because you want other people who come there and who share your view to see that they are not alone. So we need to build up that resistance to hatred. And if I encounter a lot of hate messages on the social media, I will put my objection. And it's painful, because the next day you open your account, it will be full of hate messages coming from those people and their group. But what I know is that my message was also read by people who think like me, and they could go to bed feeling reassured that they are not alone. And this is the discussion that we have to have, because otherwise, as somebody said, one of our partners lately, sometimes when she opens the laptop and reads these comments, she thinks that the world is falling apart, and all she wants to do is to open a bottle of wine and just like go away from the world. And my message is we cannot do that. We can't let the minority hate mongers dominate the discussions and make us believe that they are the real voices, because they are not. They are loud, they are organized, they are systematic, they are structured, and they tactful. They know what they are doing. But we should not fall for them. And so you have to be active in speaking up, not to change them, because you might never change them. But you want to make you know that we are there and we are not accepting it. And so if we build that critical mass, we can stop hate spreading. But we need to be active, anti-racist, and we can't be just non-racist, who open a bottle of wine and go to bed and say, like, this is not my word. But we Even we are peace lovers and we are quiet, we have to be loud and we have to be active and we have to be anti-racist to fight this cause. So I think it's so important that you speak up for others. And I think we need to keep in mind that you don't speak up for them because they can't do it, but because they need you. And the society needs this cross-ethnic, cross-religious solidarity, because otherwise minorities will never be able to save themselves just because their voices are rendered inferior, which is false. And so we have to fight against it.
Thank you. Wow, I'm already excited, motivated, and exhausted hearing everything they're all doing. I think I'm hearing a lot about long-term impacts on the need and responsibility for us to take action. And what I want to know from our panelists is, and it sounds so simple, but I think there's so much more that you're going to give me with such a simple question, is as people who are trying to amplify the voices of those who need that support with amplification, why is it important that we're having this conversation about inclusive and connected communities? And why are you doing this work? Because you get the hate speech, because it's hard, because it weighs on you every day, but you show up every day to do this work. So why is it important and why are you doing it? Whoever would like to go first. Sure.
Sure. All right. I first started getting involved in these communities because I didn't see myself represented in like pretty much everywhere I went. So I first moved to Canada when I was 15, just over 5 years ago. And I started volunteering and I started getting involved in different initiatives, but wherever I go, I'll be the only person. So I'll be the young person, the only Black person, or the only women in the room. So I feel like younger people who look like me, deserve a little bit more representation and somebody that they need to look up to. So that's why I decided to volunteer more, apply more applications for organizations that are working on inclusion and displaying the voices that are being silenced, like systemically. And so yeah, that's how I got involved. And I feel like the doors need to be opened more, and people who have the powers and who are sitting in these kind of decision-making tables and who have the power need to work harder to include the voices that are not represented in the communities. So, yeah.
What comes to mind for me is this idea of restorative justice grew out of dissatisfaction with certain elements of our criminal justice system. So in a criminal justice process, in terms of a policing response, there has to be a violation of a rule. They can't respond until some aspect of the criminal code has been broken. In restorative justice, we see, well, that's true, and we need people to respond to crime in our communities, but it's also a violation of relationships. And so restorative justice tries to address the relational aspect of crime and safety in our streets. And so we do that. In a court of law, you separate reason from emotion, because we want order in the court. In a restorative justice process, we find reason for emotion. Emotion is the engagement process of the process that we have to lean in with our heads and our hearts and work through shame, be vulnerable with each other. And then, the way that we find justice in a criminal justice process is we do it through some process of exclusion or punishment. And in a restorative justice process, we try to find reason for inclusion and reparation of relationships. And so that's the work of restorative justice, is leaning into difficult conversations and deepening the relational ecology through building understanding, deepening relationships. And they're very difficult. Like, we use restorative justice to respond to murder. But at the same time, as we've leaned into those hard places, we also find it relevant in schools, that the practice of restorative justice in schools can disrupt the school-to-prison pipeline for vulnerable populations. And that's where race and gender come in, and when you pay attention to that school-to-prison pipeline, or who we're locking up and we're not, it's group-based, it's about power. And right now, Indigenous women are the fastest growing population in our criminal justice systems, despite the fact that crime's down. So I'm deeply grateful to the work that Robert's doing. So we need to pay attention to knowing our place. We have to pay attention to who we're excluding in our criminal justice process. It's Indigenous women. We need to be paying deep attention to that. So one of the projects that I'm currently working on is working with a documentary filmmaker and doing some podcasting and some filming with women who have lived experience of the justice system and incarceration, because we often don't hear their voice.
A number of years ago, without really thinking in terms of systems, I started looking at the issues I was becoming involved with from a systems perspective. And when I was a little boy, my mother used to say, people can change, but not very much. It's hard. It's really hard to change. It's hard for all of us to change. You know, at the Center for Dialogue, we, like many other groups at SFU, have been talking about, you know, what does it mean to really lean into the commitments that the university has made around, say, reconciliation and decolonization and so on. And in the work I've been doing in the last 7 months or so, I had the chance to collaborate with over 30 Indigenous women and a couple of Indigenous men as facilitators and note-takers. And it was fascinating to watch the way my colleagues were working, coming some from similar and others from very different cultural contexts than mine. But the most striking moment for me was, you know, I came in with my agenda. In all of these events, it was just opening it up and then being quiet in the background, letting people do their thing. But we have a practice, some of us in the engagement field, of gently letting people know it's time for the break, or, you know, a little gentle way of letting people know it's time for lunch, and that sort of thing. And we thought we were moving in the right direction by not going like this, you know, or excuse me, hello, you know. But we thought if we use something gentle. So we found an o'shea. It's like a shaker made by the Wendat people, and so we were using that. And so at one of the events, I said, I used that, and then I came into the microphone, and I said, I'm so sorry. I don't like interrupting dialogues. I'm so sorry. And one of the older women at the table right near said, then don't do it. Stop it. And so I did. And for the next 2 days, the groups did what they wanted to do. They knew when it was time for them to take a break. They could smell the food. They knew when it was time to eat lunch. They knew when they were ready to move into the next phase of the program. So, but you don't learn those things unless you put yourself in places where you know, if you enjoy the privilege of being from a majority, or, you know, you're not going to be stopped if you're, I drive a 20-year-old car, but if I were driving a fancy, expensive-looking car, I'm probably not going to be stopped by a police officer in some of the cities where that happens to people who, according to the you know, at first glance, don't appear to be the right person for that car, right? But at the same time, I need to put myself in places where I am the only one or two, and listen, and learn.
I think I already had the opportunity to tell you how my own personal experience led me to take on a leadership role and for other minorities. So for me, the journey was to make my own experience as a boost of inspiration, to realize that others might have similar problems and to go on and help their cause and help the fight. But if I want to be really concrete and personal, like when you are a UN reporter, some of the activities you do are just like mandatory and sometimes boring as hell. And you have to go to, like a lot of diplomatic negotiations and meetings, and sometimes, they throw a lot of money into organize, 2 days conference in New York on something that, like, it's so shallow, and you understand that it's all about just trying to prove a commitment to something, but it's not deep enough to actually achieve a change. So you can be very discouraged because you feel like it's lip service, and then when it really comes to concrete actions, you see how every really meaningful initiative would be like torpedoed and stopped. But why I think I was really privileged is that I actually saw certain activities that I knew helped others, and that kept me going. And so I had stories when I managed to take people out of prison. I stopped evictions. I know that I had impact on people's lives. And every time when something like that happens, you just get a boost and you know what you need to do. And sometimes these are really just simple stories. You travel to a community that never heard about the United Nations, but then you leave your business card, and then when something happens to them, they know how to call you. And then they call you, they tell you their issue, and then you get back to the government, and then you just show the government that the UN is watching you, and you can't do anything you want to do. And then so they would stop the violations and restore justice. So I was privileged because I was put in a position when I could actually see impact of my work. So I was trying to struggle through all these mandatory, boring things I had to do as a UN official. And I was trying to just really merit strength from my visits to countries. When I traveled sometimes 6-8 hours on really rocky roads to see the pygmies in Cameroon, the Quilombos in Brazil, IDPs in Sri Lanka or in Iraq. And those visits, when they told me what they need and how I can help them, it really boosted my own inspiration. But it's not always easy. You can lose hope. And when we work on human rights, what we want to see is paradise. We want everybody to be equal. We want everybody to have free education. We want everybody to have free healthcare. You want to see people in housing with sanitation. And so I think where we want to go is so far, and it can be such a distance that we can never actually reach. What helps me is that I'm trying to see it on a line of a progress. And I see how we started years ago and how we want to get, where we're going to get, but I'm able to see the little progress we make. Every time I encounter new minority people who just had a university degree and they got a job in a very strong company, or I see actual politicians or ministers, indigenous ministers claiming their place, I'm like, yes, I can see the signs, we are getting somewhere. So I think when you work on human rights, you really have to be able to see little progress. And if 0 is nowhere and 10 is the paradise, if we shift from 5 to 5.5, or from 5.5 to 6, if we are getting there where we want to go, I think that should give us energy. So this is how I'm trying to think and just see all the encouraging signs. Because if we give up, then it's really the end of the story. And as Robert said again, I have to link back to you. If you have any little power or privilege in your hand that you can use for others, I believe you have to use it. And so all of us in this room, we have that privilege because we are in Vancouver, we managed to come here, we had the assets to come, to use a taxi, to use a car, or even to buy a metro ticket. And we came here because we know about this event, so we had internet access. You paid $20, you had the money. So all of us who are here, we already hold a little bit of responsibility because we are privileged. Even if you don't feel that way, we have issues, we all have money problems. But I think it's so important to recognize that once you have a little bit of that privilege, then you have to use it for others. And that solidarity will bring us forward. But if you just step back and then you get comfortable with your life and just enjoy your privileges, and you know, it's possible, but I don't see the point in living a life like that.
Questions that I have are just bursting. I'm trying to figure out an order to do it in that sensical, and I'm sure all of you have lots of questions. So I want to start off by picking up on what I've heard a lot of you say at different points, which is this idea of amplification, of stories, of being heard, and talk a little bit more about what we are hearing, and not to say giving us specific examples or stories. Rita, you shared some already, but we're hearing from people about the kinds of changes they want to see that will help them feel connected and included in our communities. And I know from Brenda's work and our work together that we're hearing a lot of stories from young people, from adults, and I want to give an opportunity for those of you who are in community, who are trying to amplify the voices and support other people to be heard, to share some of what they are saying they need. So I think, Brenda, I might start with you, and then we'll go through the panel.
So another thing that so to bring in the idea of story from a restorative justice point of view, because in a court of law, we just focus on the facts, guilt or innocence, right? We need the facts, separate them from the story, decontextualize the story. But in restorative justice, we love stories. And one of my mentors was Kay Pranis, and she learned from many people, amongst the indigenous people of the Yukon, and she says, the number of people who listen respectfully to my story is a function of power in our culture. Subsequently, listening to someone's story is a way of empowering them, validating their self-worth, value, and integrity. And so we do a lot of storytelling. And one of my favorite, I love working with two groups of people in particular, women, particularly minority women. Some of my best stories come from favelas in Brazil, but with women, and children. And one of my favorite projects is with Equitas, and we partner with Senator Landon Pearson's Center for Children's Rights in Ottawa. And she came up with an idea called Shaking the Movers. And the idea is to really listen to children, to validate their intrinsic worth as children and their rights as children, which are distinctive to the rights of humans. They have the right to play. Most of you there, you lost that right when you became an adult, sorry. And then they have the right to rest, and most young people don't know their rights. And so we in partnership with Equitas, because they have these great activities, you learn their rights through play-based experiential learning. Like as an Outward Bound instructor, I'm all over it. I'm like, sign me up. And so we work with Senator Landon Pearson and her team and this idea of shaking the movers. And so we create safe space, and we use restorative justice ideas of how you create the safe space. And when Landon first talked to me, she said, Brenda, your job is to create the safe institutional space and then get out of the way. I said, oh, sounds like a great job. No. And the idea is for young people to empower young people. And so we train young undergraduate students here at SFU to hold the safe space. And we give them layers, weeks and weeks of training, and everything from how do you hold a safe space from a restorative justice point of view to whatever the area of specialty that we've been working on, whether it be, we focused on diversity this year. Our very first one was working with sexually exploited youth in Vancouver, so we worked with children of the street, and then with Equitas. And one of the very first time we did this, we were working with sexually exploited young people in Surrey. And they sort of lived on one side of the street, and SFU was on the other side of the street. And, but we were facilitating the space at SFU, and they were feeling really proud to be at SFU, because normally they didn't go there. It wasn't a safe space for them. But the young facilitators did such a great job of bringing young people, very vulnerable young people, into that space, that they kept on, we needed the social worker when we first started bringing them in, because she was trusted, and we needed to gain that trust. But then they started bringing their friends. And there was this young woman, Kiki, and she was there, and someone saw her walking over to SFU, and she said, she said, "What are you doing here today?" And Kiki says, "Today, I belong here." And isn't that what you want for everyone? It would be just, that story just keeps resonating again and again.
Last June, 2018, there are a lot of amazing things that happen in this city. And I see some of the people here in this room who are part of that work, and I'm sure there are a lot of others that we don't know about all the work that people are doing in this area. I love events like this because you learn so much about what's going on. But one of the interesting experiences I had that I don't know if anybody here was part of that process. It was the City of Vancouver's annual Immigration Summit, and the theme last June was reducing poverty, policy changes that are needed to reduce poverty among refugees and asylum seekers. So it was fascinating. The first meeting, we looked around the table, and there were representatives of 3 levels of government, people from settlement service organizations, and it only took about, and universities, it only took about 15 minutes maybe before everyone around the table realized that we were missing a whole segment to plan the event, which was refugees and asylum seekers, right? Or, I mean, it seems so obvious. It seems so obvious, but it's sometimes it takes a moment, but it didn't take us very long. It was 15 minutes, I think. And the rest of the, for about 20 minutes, we talked about who had the best access to those communities. And at the next meeting, we had, I don't know, about 10 people who were refugees and asylum seekers, or relatively recent ones. And it completely transformed the process, as you can imagine, as it should have. But we needed to do something else, because imagine the dialogue tables, and there's a facilitator and a note taker, and there's a refugee or an asylum seeker whose language skills in English might not be strong enough. So, you have interpreters and whisper translators and that sort of thing. But we needed something more. The city provided honoraria to all of the people who were living in poverty, refugees and asylum seekers, in a very dignified, discreet way. So they were compensated for their time. There were short films made so people could share their stories. Edited beautifully by a producer who donated his time. But the other thing that happened was we designated a refugee or asylum seeker to serve as the host at each table. Because we needed to address the power imbalance. These are small steps. It didn't change the world. Policy recommendations were made, and I hope things will change. But the reason I wanted to share that example is because one of the things that I've increasingly come to believe, and this is new learning, my mom was wrong about this one, people can change in some big ways. And one is that some of us, and I count myself in that group, are involved in too many things. And if we kind of flit from one project to another, I tend to work in a trauma space with cultural complexity and the interface for governments and post-secondary institutions in those spaces. But if, it takes a really long time to build relationships with people. It takes a long time to share stories and find out who they are and share who you are. And the relationship-based approach, for me, is just, I think, far more important than a transactional approach. But it also means that I need to think, and this is just my own experience, others will have a different experience, one has this sense of, of the planet being on fire, literally. So where do we turn? And I think it's important for us to look at all the things we're doing, because I'll bet if you added the number of people in this room and had them write down all the organizations and projects they're involved with, there would be a lot more of them than there are people. Mm-hmm. And what that suggests to me, my own inventory led me to that conclusion. I don't mean to assume, but I have a feeling. That maybe we need to be doing fewer things, but doing them over a longer term. Doing them more thoughtfully, doing them more intentionally, finding more partners, and seeing through more of what we're involved with thinking about accountability and thinking about implementation and thinking about evaluation and thinking about mentoring and getting out of the way. But that can't happen if we're jumping from one crisis to another, one project to another, one problem to another. And I think a lot of us who care about human rights maybe do that a little more than perhaps we might.
Yeah. I will try to connect to what you two have said about being at the discussions, and I now remember the previous High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson. She used to say that you are either around the table or on the menu. I'm sure you heard this thing. So I think this is an important thing. It's either that, as you said, sometimes you have to secure a place around the table, or otherwise you are on the menu. And so I have been shocked during my many years of a UN official about the underrepresentation of marginalized groups around discussion tables. And what shocks me is that should be obvious. Like, we have been talking about inclusion and the right to participation and the right to representation and self-representation for decades. So you would think that we can discuss about how exactly do that, what kind of affirmative action works. But the fact that, and I'm very, now I feel comfortable to talk about Brazil. Silvio is not here, which is a pity, but I will bring up his country, Brazil. It says he's Brazilian. And I would bring up Brazil because I was recently there, and this is a country which takes pride of racial democracy, as you probably know. And they have really good data and disaggregated data. And so 52% of the country currently self-identifies as brown and black. So this is what we need to remember. More than half of the society is brown or black. Now, when I went to a mission to Brazil, I was shocked by the homogeneity of the different spaces. So I would go to a ministry and I would sit down with only white people. And like, it's finance people, it's the foreign ministry, whatever. Then I went to the racial equality directive. It was full of black people, as if they could only take part in those discussions related to race, but not on discussions to finance or foreign affairs. And even in that ministry, I encountered a young woman who was a banker, and she said that she would love to work on that, but they only let her work on racial issues because she's being black. This is what she's supposed to know. And then I would meet one member of a Senate who was a black man. And by the way, he tabled a piece of legislation on Roma people. I was so impressed. There are 500,000 Roma people in Brazil. People don't know. And he was the one who tabled the legislation on the Roma. And then, so he talked about the Senate, and then he said, it's 81 people in the Senate, and I just happened to ask him, how many of them are, black like you? And he said, well, I'm alone. And I'm like, what? In a society where more than half of the people are brown and black, how can you have one single Afro-Brazilian in a Senate of 81 people? So these are shocking data, and the problem about this that, it has so many complications and consequences. It's not only that how can then a legislative body ensure good policies and laws if the people affected by it are not part of it. But of course it has consequences, again, as Hannah, you mentioned about role models, how can young people imagine that I can be there if they don't see their own people? And then if you see it in the Senate, of course you will see it in the judiciary, you will see it in the police laws, you will see it in the law enforcement bodies. So one of my I think most shocking observations during these visits was, again, this lack of representation of minorities, and the lack of their voices to be secured in discussions, and how people are just comfortable to take decisions over everybody and then blame, for example, the black people for not cooperating with the police. And this is insane. If you don't have a single, I went to Sri Lanka, for example, in the northern part of Sri Lanka, there is a military. There was not a single person in position who would come from a Tamil or a Muslim community. Now, how do you expect those communities who live in their traditional territory to trust a military force if they don't have their people inside? So I think one of the, I mean, again, I take it out of the, if with your permission, from the local national context, and I put it globally, because this is a major problem about inclusion. Like, how do we want to have good and inclusive policies if we don't have the people who have the knowledge and the power to represent their own interest? And I think this is a big task ahead of many, even progressive countries.
Well, for this specific question, I want to go back to my involvement with Admiko and Fresh Voices. So these groups are made out of young immigrant and refugee students and adult allies and supporters and educators. And just within that group, that diverse group of having immigrant and refugees, everybody has different walks of life, and we have different stories, and we experience it, maybe the Vancouver School Board or school system or Burnaby or the Lower Mainland school systems differently. So every individual in that group bring their own experiences. So whenever a question is brought up, everybody has different answers. We think like we have this final or related stories, but everybody experience it, they experience differently. So stories do have a lot of impacts, I think. Putting one group of community in one box is not the right thing to do, because that's not the fact. Although we, for me as a Black woman or as an immigrant, I have a different experience than other Black women or other immigrants. So tokenizing people and putting one person in the seat to represent an entire community is not the right approach towards change. And yeah, I feel like we have a lot of work to do, because I go to events and different venues and see myself being the only one, or I am the diversity, or I am a representative for an entire community or multiple communities. So yeah, so we need to value people's story and individualities as well, because we're all different, and yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. Brenda. Brenda, I didn't ask you for it, but thanks for the Equitas plug that you put in there. I am going to open there's some really interesting ideas here in terms of actions. Robert, you shared some of them. We talked about creating opportunities for shared realities and understanding. Hannah, you talked so much about not tokenizing and being genuine with who we're including, making sure that the right voices are at the table. And Brenda, you talked so much about engaging with community partner organizations and creating educational spaces for young people to engage in the dialogue. And so thank you for sharing some of those ideas with us. And now I want to turn it to the floor to invite all of you to ask questions of our fantastic, knowledgeable, inspiring, esteemed panel. And just raise your hand, and I'm just going to run at you with the microphone.
Hello, everybody. I'm Khatra Daryabi. So it is my pleasure to be here to learn to be a fighter from all the freedom fighters that are here to inspire us to raise our voices. So I have a question and want to ask how to bring or initiate a revolution mind in a society that mostly lean to a religion belief, or mostly we can say in a wrong belief that leads them to stop women from getting education or to stop women to see a real world. Thank you.
Would like to answer it first? So, one by one? Or whoever wants to answer it.
Yeah, but I think we can also take more.
Sure, yeah, we can take more questions and then do them all at once. Sure. So let's take 3 or 4 questions, and then the panel will respond to them all collectively. Do we have a next question? Yes.
Thank you so much for this inspiring speeches. My name is Altanay. I come from a country where 2 interethnic conflicts took place. I'm from Kyrgyzstan. And my question is, how do you, in a setting where basically the minority is oppressed and media aggravates or incites hatred, how do you make sure that media gives equal voice to both sides and does not dehumanize one side or the other, and basically covers in an equal way? Thank you.
Great question. Thank you.
Hi. Good evening. My name is Ela. So my question is actually specifically to you, Rita, about your mission and your role at UN. And just thinking about the global world and the international power and how the countries were respecting United Nations after the Second World War. And now things are shifting quite much in everywhere, all over the world. And the power dynamics are shifting between those countries too. So how the international community is receiving UN and how much it is respecting and listening. More than respecting, I think we have all these treaties, they are all binding, and some countries have all these reservations on them, on the most important articles often. And so I'm wondering what's your experience going to those countries and how you are seeing the change. And I really appreciate your inspiration and what keeps you motivated about the progress. So within that, hopeful mind, I'm just wondering, how do you see UN can be more impactful and effective in their reports and lobbying work to the governments?
Thank you, Ela. So I'll turn it to the panel now if you want to address those questions. So we had one about women and how do we empower women and educate them and give them the opportunity to rise up and take action. One about media and how to work with the media when we're not always certain that the story is representing both sides equally. And then what is the effectiveness of the UN and how are states responding to the UN human rights systems and processes as they are currently? Would you like to start, Rita?
Yeah. So I would love to respond to all the three, but I don't want to dominate the discussion. So I think I will, because you directed it to me, so I will answer to the last one, and I start with that, which is a very complex question, and I'm very happy to stay with you and discuss over it. As you said, the main problem now is this overall skepticism in multilateral bodies, which is everywhere. Like, people are started questioning the use of the United Nations and whether it actually contributes or exacerbates, whether it contributes to peace or exacerbates conflicts. And my response is that, the UN has such functions in terms of vaccinating children, feeding the poor. This is the best organization we have at the moment. And I'm a believer in the United Nations. At the same time, I also feel that we must be more accessible, we must be more diverse, we must go more and more down to the grassroots communities. I am alarmed by the fact that our UN field offices are like fortresses, that communities don't feel that they can knock at the door and talk about their issues, especially the vulnerable communities. The UN is all about trying to prevent mass atrocities, right? Like, that's the main thing. We have seen genocide happening within months, so the UN has really tried since to, there is this Human Rights Upfront initiative, which is across the UN system, but we are trying to do is really prevent mass atrocity prevent mass atrocities. But again, my question comes back to what I just talked about, is the representation. And I'm very, very, very sad to tell you that many times when I go to UN field offices, even the UN field offices are composed by the elite. You sometimes among the staff, you don't see the indigenous peoples, you don't see Afro communities, you don't see religious or linguistic minorities. And sometimes when I ask my colleagues in a certain country, like, can you please take me to the suburbs? Can you please take me to these remote communities? They will tell me, like, oh, we don't have a contact, but give us a day, we will get back to you. And then I'm like so disappointed, because how do you want to prevent you know, much as this to happen, if you don't even have a direct communication channel with those communities, people should feel free to communicate to the UN. They should be free to literally knock on the door, open, and come in and say, look, I am frightened. People are putting hate speech statements against my community. They want to burn our villages. Please help me. But the UN still gets this kind of, you know, this inaccessible fortress identity, and I'm very unhappy about that. And when it comes to like reporting obligations, it's funny because we do have a lot of countries complaining that they can't keep up with their reporting obligations, and there's too much that has to be done. But if you look into my committee, and the delays that member states have because they just don't want to report. We have more than 50 countries who are 10 years late with their report. So when countries tell me like, we are so tired of reporting, I'm like, okay, but when have you last reported? And then some of them, like, I mean, we have hundreds of delayed reports. So I think we have to be very careful to take some criticism on board, which are legitimate, but then to be also careful because there is a lot of pushback. But I think we need to keep the UN as it is, because in many countries, and you asked me about how it is perceived in different regions, I can tell you there are certain regions in Asia and Africa where the UN is the only trusted body. I've been to countries after conflict when communities had no trust in their national leaders, and they asked me to bring in the UN troops and put a UN flag that this is the territory of the UN. I told them we can't do this, we don't have such, we don't have a military. But some people really place their last hope into the UN. So we have to keep this in mind, and we have to be the trusted party. And I just hope that, you know, with the current like budget withdrawal and everything, I really have my best hope that we can continue and step up our fight. And just for your information, the United Nations Human Rights Office receives 3% of the overall UN budget. So when we are trying to be so ambitious about reaching human rights, you have to keep in mind 3% of the overall UN budget. So when they criticize the UN human rights system for not achieving a lot, we have to bring back the question, so why don't you give enough money for us to achieve a lot more? So these are the, I think, the current tendencies, and I'm very happy to follow up with you on the details as well.
Just gonna speak of a personal experience. So for me, it was the young women around me that inspire me to do more. So I make sure that I connect with mentors and school staff and community members who are already involved in politics or are in, like, that inspire me a lot. So I go up to them for advices, or if I need help with like doing any like application forms, or if I'm trying to apply for school or any kind of stuff. So I just go up to them, ask for advices, and like if they know what I'm interested in, they also pass me on opportunities and like things to attend or events to go to, or like lectures and all that. So I'll say connect with the people in your community because they're really good resources, and usually they're more than happy to help out.
Just a couple little anecdotes to add to the conversation. One of the things that we talk about in the field of restorative justice when we're leaning into difficult conversations is developing communities of care. So before you bring people together that are different, you first surround them with a community of care. And I think that's really important to ready people. And sometimes it takes a long time to have the more difficult conversation, but just developing a community of care is a really great step. And often that community care is people like yourselves. So we often say, you know, find your pack or your herd and love them hard. Hold each other up. There's a great word in Squamish Nation. It says, chin chin stawai. We can all learn it. Chin chin stawai. It means to hold each other up. And so we should all be doing that, holding each other. So you find the group that's like you. And some of the group that we do with, the work that we do with homicide, family members of homicide victims, they like to talk to other people that have experienced homicide in their family. That's the first step for them, because they can understand that people could empathize with them. They've walked in their shoes in some sense. So I think the first step in any sort of courageous move and all the work of defending human rights and minority rights has to be courageous. You have to work with your head and your heart, and you have to find the people that are going to love you hard. And so that's the first good step. And then along the way, then you're going to find your allies. They're going to pull you up a little, and then partner with the UN. But it's always about pulling each other up along the way.
One of the challenges that I've been thinking about for the last number of years, and some of my colleagues who find themselves in a similar situation to me, organizing an event or collaborating with colleagues on an event, and then if there isn't an Indigenous member of the planning committee, right, who's in the organization, who's working with you very closely, you know, okay, so we need to recognize that we are on Indigenous land. We need to, you know, invite an elder. And I've been struggling with this for a long time, and there's always something odd about you're in a non-Indigenous organization and you're inviting an elder who actually is the host of the land to welcome you to the land, and then, you know, is the elder still in the room? You know what I mean? And so I started to share with colleagues, if your event is a big enough event that you need that an elder needs to be there, then maybe the elder needs to be there at the beginning. Or ask yourself why, if your how many Indigenous people are working in your organization? I mean, those are, like you were talking about, the rooms that are homogeneous. And I want to give you one example of a concrete case of working outside of the box where I felt there was a move toward a decolonized experience. It was a day-long symposium on racism, and it was I think it was called Living Together, Richmond. It was in the city of Richmond. It was organized by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation with a number of local organizations. It wasn't a perfect event. There were you know, it could have been stronger. But the thing about it that so amazed me was that the elder who was there, he calls himself a wisdom keeper or knowledge keeper, Shane Point. Some of you have met Shane before, I think. So he came in the morning. Now, yes, there were Indigenous people on the panels. The panels were very, you know, multiracial and all kinds of diversity in the program. But it was the role of the elder that really left this indelible impression on me, and I think on a lot of other people who were there. So Shane Point opened the event, shared a story. It was very moving and quite beautiful. And then for the rest of the day, there were round tables with facilitators and note takers, most of whom were students and trained in dialogue. And there were people from the government, from the police, from this community, that community. And one of the issues that was really quite live in Richmond at that time was tensions around immigration and real estate, and it was sort of focused on signs in shops that were in Chinese without an English translation. And one of the people at the event was actually a woman who had been writing these irate letters that I think, you know, could be characterized as racist around this whole issue. So Shane Point circulated around the whole room all day long, listening to the dialogues. He knew what was going on, and there were some very heated arguments at the table where that particular person was sitting. At the end of the event, he didn't say, "You racist," you know, he shared a story about his grandmother and how his grandmother said to him when he was a little boy, "You see those people who moved in down the street? They're from India. Go learn how to say hello in their language. Do you see that family who live across the street from us now? They're from China. Go find out how to say hello in their language." And what I heard him saying, I'm not going to put words in his mouth, but this is how I took it. He was trying to gently but firmly remind everybody in the room that English is not the traditional ancestral language of the indigenous people of Richmond. And that the indigenous people of that area, of this Coast Salish region, have been welcoming people from other places, speaking other languages, for a really long time. And you know, we talk about the way that diversity or multiculturalism are ingrained in Canada, at least in our imagination, if not in reality, and we know in reality it's a little messier than that. But I think we don't adequately take account of the degree to which that foundation of inclusion is rooted in the indigenous peoples and cultures of this land. So anyway, it's just an example because it was a case where an indigenous knowledge keeper was holding the entire conversation, the entire event about racism, with all the tensions in his hand in a way. And it was a beautiful moment, and it also broke out of the box of the elder welcome, and you know, that I think many of us are trying to escape. We need to work a little harder at that.
So I'm aware of the time, and I want to make sure we're respectful of the time we asked you to come. Is there one final question? Then I want to start wrapping it up so everyone can get out of here on time. Yes, we'll take one more question. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. So I'm Saima Daryabi, and I'm from Afghanistan. So I've been one of the luckiest girl in this world that I'm here today and listening to your inspired words and encourage me to fight for girls' rights. But I had one question because, like in Afghanistan, in my country, like we face discrimination, we face racism. Even my own father died because of this discrimination in this, like, though I was just 14 years old and now like I'm 16 years old, but so many girls in my country like are dreaming to become like a better person and to become like a better version of themselves. But what is the best advice you can give them to them that they should like rise from the ashes and become a better person? Because like they've been under so much like pressure from their environment, and they can even talk of being who they are and who they want to be. And what can you give to me so I could transfer this message to them and trying to be ambassador for themselves in order to help them? Thank you.
I think you looked at me, so I try to answer, but my answer is that look at you. I mean, you are already here speaking up for them. You are a role model. And if you could show yourself to them that this is what they can become, it's already something. And as you said, there are really difficult societies and difficult countries. And I used to live in Somalia. And I used to teach at the Law University. And it was imagine a classroom with 91 people. And I was a human rights teacher, and human rights was considered as a complete Western agenda. So I had a real difficulty in like how to even start the discussion. I was trying to be on the safe side. I didn't bring in like real Western articles, but I was trying to find Islamic scholars who would discuss issues. But I always realized that the girls who were in the classroom, they were financed by UNDP. There was a special program to bring girls to the school, the law school. They were always quiet, and they were not comfortable to speak up. And I was really sad about it. But then after a second or the third occasion, it's a segregated community, so the boys have to leave the room first. You know, they sit separately on the bus. And so I just finished my class, and then all the boys left, but the girls sat still. And then when the last boy left, they locked the door, they closed it, and they were like, "Can we talk to you now?" And I'm like, "Of course." And they were like, "So what's up with polygamy?" And we're like, "Is it according to human rights? We feel like it's not fair. We can't have 4 husbands. Why can't they have 4 wives?" And of course, I knew that I'm not in a position to answer these questions, but what we did is that we started discussing behind closed doors. And so that gave such a power to these girls to start questioning at least what's going on around them. And questioning is the first thing of challenging. Now, I don't want to take stand on polygamy. I live in a Muslim country with a Muslim husband. We have polygamy family members. It's a very tricky issue. But I'm just telling you that there are ways to start the conversation. And once you start it, it can bring the agenda forward. So I think the first step is to create, again, those safe spaces where girls can come together and talk. And in Afghanistan, there are some really interesting initiatives about hair salons and beauty salons and how that can be a safe space. So it's an interesting thing to, find those spots which already exist and just bring the girls safely. And if they can already start questioning what's going on around them and then empowering each other, and then see you being here in Vancouver, talking in so eloquently like all of you in the microphone, I think that's already so much that you can give them back. So if you have a way to record your things, send it back, tell them this is all is all possible, sky is the limit. I think it's a lot that you can do to them to empower them, and it's only you can do that because you come from there, you know their way, you know their life, and I really think that you should play that if you have the strength, please play that role and help them believing in themselves.
Thank you, Rita. So I'm going to move to asking each of the panelists for 1 or 2 sentences, because we're going to do it quickly, a final reflection. This is your opportunity. I mean, I don't know how you follow an inspiration like what you just said, Rita, but a final moment to say that inspirational thought to leave us all as we walk out of this room, or a final thought on action that we can all take as we walk out of this room. So 1 or 2 sentences for that last umph on our way out. And of course, whoever is ready to start is welcome to start. So I don't always put Hannah on the spot.
I don't know, I'm still thinking about all these great stories we heard. So I think everyone has a story to tell. And thank you for amplifying the voices of young people. And you've clearly found your voice, so maybe help make people find theirs and tell their stories. So if we all listen to someone's story this week that we normally don't hear, that would be a good step. So listen to someone's story.
Yeah. All right. I'd like to close out by saying everybody here, I believe, is a community leader. So whenever you get the chance to organize events or any kind of venue, I would like to ask you to prioritize diversity and inclusion. So in your room, make sure that the community and the places that we live in is represented in the room. So make sure there's more than 1 Black person, there's more than 1 Indigenous person, there's more than few people of color in the room.
Just want to build on what you said. Sorry, I might leave with this. Don't let me. I just want to build on what you said, and challenge myself and all those of us who are involved in organizing things to ask ourselves who's not in the room. Instead of thinking whom do we need to engage to make the event work, who's engaging whom, right? Who's the we? The we has to be a much more diverse we, and not just because of the importance in equity terms of ensuring that people who come from marginalized demographics are better represented, or that's of course not what we're suggesting. It's really that we all need to be at the table. The issues that we're facing around the world are so complex. The forces that have conspired to create the problems that we're wrestling with, from war and peace to climate change to racism to misogyny, and where do we stop? We all have a part to play, but we don't know what we don't know, right? And we can only find that out if the we around the table is a very much more diverse we that looks like the diversity of the world or the society at large. So at the very first step, while an idea is bouncing around in your head, ask who's not in the room. Because if we won't know what we don't know, and the creativity and the impact and the systemic change is far less likely to happen. The process has to be integrated with the goal. If the goal is equity and diversity and inclusion, then our processes have to be equitable and diverse and inclusive, right? So if you're working with a group of almost entirely white people in a particular position, in a particular organization, and the challenge is to think about equity and diversity and what should we white people do to make our program more equitable and diverse and inclusive. Well, don't just think about it yourselves. Bring in a much more diverse group of people to think about the problem, right?
I think you said already everything. I would really want all of us to live with the question in our head about what we can do in our professional life and in our private life to enhance diversity and to ensure inclusion. And so in our professional capacity, whatever it is, it doesn't matter, we can all do something. If you work for a university, organize a dialogue, invite people. If you're from the corporate world, look at your management, look at the diversity in the management, maybe establish a mechanism to ensure that there is an appropriate representation of communities. If you are an NGO, then try to see how you can partner up to make sure that you work with all communities affected by violence, violations, and abuses. But then also to think outside of the box, and again, what you can do as an individual. How do you stand up if you see something on the street? Like, just do you go away because you just don't want to be in conflict situations? Or can you become the one who says, stop it? And by that, you will also welcome other people who will also say, stop it. So are you the one who can start building that critical mass to respond to all these inequalities and injustices? And so I think this is something that I hope we can take away from today, is just to reflect on it, just to maybe go home and think one night about what we can do more. Because we can all do more. I know I can do more, and I have to do more, because obviously where we are at the moment is not where we want to be at the end of the day. So I hope we all live with inspiration, and as you said, it's not the beginning. I mean, it's the beginning, but not the end of our collective efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Before you all run out, I'm asking your patience for 3 more minutes. I'm going to take us to 9 o'clock on the dot. I want to start off by thanking our panelists, Rita, Robert, Brenda, and Hannah, for your knowledge, your inspiration, your wisdom, your wealth. And my colleague Taylor, who many of you have seen running around, has small tokens of appreciation that she's going to pass out. And while she does that, I am going to move on to the next part of our agenda, which is quick but really important, and that's the recognition of the Play It Fair Award. For those of you that don't know, each year Equitas acknowledges the great contributions of a Canadian organization, school, or municipality by presenting them with the Play It Fair Award. Play It Fair is a toolkit that helps children aged 6 to 12 learn about acceptance, inclusion, and diversity. And we're super honored this year to be presenting the award to a long-time partner in Vancouver, and that's the YMCA of Greater Vancouver, and particularly the Healthy Child's Development Team, recognizing their long-standing commitment to children's rights education and the integration of Play It Fair into their programs, in their Kids Club licensed before and after school care, and for setting an example for what we can do as everyday part of our programming to inspire children and to create change. So I'd like to invite Pam Chater and Josh Miller to come up and accept the award on behalf of the YMCA with my colleague Julie. I awkwardly said. I can't say enough about how amazing this team is. I remember the first time they said, oh no, our summer camps are going to do Play It Fair activities and talk about inclusion and diversity every day. And I was like, what, every day? And they're like, yeah, they play games, so why can't they play games about inclusion every day? And I was like, yes, can we multiply you? So congratulations, it's been a privilege to work with you for so many years. So finally, I would like to end by closing the space today. And to close the space requires an immense amount of thanks and heartfelt and the recognition of what Brenda said, and I'm going to say it badly, chin-chin stuai, to hold each other up. And there are people who have held Taylor and I up on this process of organizing this first ever event. And I'd like to begin again by thanking Joe Hall and the SFU Vancity Office for Community Engagement, Brenda Morrison at the Center for Restorative Justice, and Shanti Besso and Jennifer Reddy at Lifelong Learning for all of their support. I would like to thank our panelists again. You have been huge inspirations, and we consider ourselves so grateful to have you here. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for taking time out on a Tuesday night to come and sit and listen and engage with us. Equitas works with over 50 partners in the Lower Mainland to create change and to inspire young people to be a part of that change. Right now, we have community action projects taking place nationally where young people are taking ownership of the issues that are impacting their lives and taking action for change. And I'd encourage you, if you're interested in our work, to go at the table behind where my colleague Stephanie is standing in the beautiful red top to grab some information about our work. We also don't want the conversation to end here. This is a conversation that is ongoing. We talked about, Brenda said, hearing stories. We talked about creating spaces. And we want to encourage all of you to create those spaces and continue the conversation. This is part of a national series of conversations we're doing, but we want you to take it home, take it to work, take it to your family and friends. So on your way out, you're also going to receive a guide on continuing the conversation and how you can host your own kitchen table conversations. Grab the guide, take a look at it, host your conversation. And if you're so motivated and active on social media, let us know how it goes using the hashtag Equitalks, not tax, Equitalks, and or email Taylor and I. I'm not a good social media person, so by all means, email me and let me know how it's going. We want to hear everything that's happening. And finally, last but not least, when you walked in, you received a pamphlet that has information about what we're doing here today. And on it, there's a little tearaway about a donation that you can make to Equitas. Obviously, no pressure. If anyone is so inclined, then we would happily accept a donation today, and there's an envelope at the back or any other point. But more important than that, in some ways, is come and learn about the work we're doing. Talk to us, because we want to engage with all of you. When we work together, we can actually create that change. So with all of that, thank you to everyone for being here. Enjoy the rest of your night, and safe travels home.